My son sent me a text on the eve of his wedding that shattered my heart and then sealed his fate. Dad, do not come tomorrow. Lacey says, your blue-collar vibe will embarrass her family. I did not reply. I did not call. I simply opened my laptop and clicked one button that turned their dream wedding into a nightmare. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a can of leather conditioner and a worn chamois cloth. The smell of wax and leather filled the room, threading through the faint scent of sawdust that never really leaves a man like me. It was a Friday night in my small house on the outskirts of Detroit. The house is paid off. It is quiet. It has been empty since my wife Elaine passed away 5 years ago. On the back of the kitchen door hung my navy suit, 12 years old, but I had it dry cleaned just for tomorrow. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into it, drop a quick comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something about knowing people are tuning in from all different corners of the day that makes sharing a story like this feel a little less lonely. Now, a quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific, real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it, and that part is very real. 12 years old, but freshly dry cleaned, ready for tomorrow. My son Derek was getting married, 66 years on this earth, and the name is Hank Kowalczyk. I worked the chamois in slow circles across the toe of my dress shoe, making sure every scuff was gone. A man ought to look decent at his son's wedding. Retired contractor. 4 decades I gave to that trade hands, split open spine, protesting every morning, pouring foundations and raising walls so Derek could walk a different road. I wanted him signing checks, not cashing them. Soft hands instead of scarred ones. And it worked. Derek is 28. The suits he wears would have bought my first vehicle twice over. He rolls around in a Mercedes I finance, though the story he feeds his friends involves a performance bonus. I glanced at the kitchen clock. 7 in the evening. A call should have come by now. Some excitement, maybe gratitude, something. 2 days earlier, I had wired $85,000 to the Sterling Grand, the wedding venue, covering the deposit and the final balance in a single shot. That was Lacey's doing. My future daughter-in-law would settle for nothing less than the Sterling Grand. Nothing else met her requirements, apparently. The phone skittered across the table. I dried my hands on a paper towel and reached for it, already feeling a small warmth in my chest. A text. From Derek. I found my reading glasses and put them on. Read it once, read it a second time, pulled the glasses off, fogged the lenses, polished them clean, settled them back on my nose, and read it a third time. Dad, I am so sorry, but Lacey is really stressed. She says having you there will make her anxious. Her family is very high society from Boston, and well, you know you are a bit too working class. They are uncomfortable around people who look like they labor. It is better if you do not come. I will send you photos. Love, Derek. I held the phone until the screen died on its own. The kitchen went absolutely silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Too working class. The phrase kept circling. I turned my hands over and studied them. Calloused palms. A scar riding my left thumb from a table saw that got away from me back in '98. A neck permanently bronzed from decades under an open sky. These hands poured the concrete Derek's childhood home stands on. These hands cleaned him up when Elaine was too sick to get out of bed. These hands wrote the tuition checks, the private school checks, every check that shaped the man he became. And yesterday, these same hands signed away $85,000. Anger didn't come first. What arrived was heavier and colder, a stone dropping to the bottom of my gut. 28 years of sacrifice, and I'd been building over a void the whole time. He couldn't even dial my number. A text. That's what I rated. His father, sole parent for 5 years running, disposed of by text message. I let my mind go to Lacey, 26 years old, carries herself like royalty. Told Derek her family has generational wealth. That accent she uses isn't from anywhere real. She assembled it from television. She snaps her fingers at restaurant staff. Derek just orbits her, agreeable and spineless. I raised him to be gentle. Somewhere that gentleness rotted into something else. I pushed back from the table and stood. Both knees announced themselves. I pulled a beer from the refrigerator, held it a moment, then set it back. Beer wasn't right for this. I found the bourbon, poured 2 fingers into a glass, and swallowed it in one motion. The heat cut through the fog. I turned and looked at my suit on the door. It didn't look like an outfit anymore. It looked like a getup the kind a fool wears when he's convinced himself he belongs somewhere he isn't wanted. I took it off the hook, carried it to the hall closet, and buried it behind the winter coats at the very back. No suit needed tomorrow. I came back to the kitchen. My phone sat there on the table. I picked it up, thumb drifting over Derek's name. Every muscle in me wanted to call to demand an answer, to make him hear what this felt like. Then I let my hand drop. To what end? A man who has to plead for a seat at his own son's wedding has already been beaten. The only thing I still owned outright in that moment was my dignity. They would not get to hear me break, neither the sobbing version nor the screaming one. I settled at my desk in the living room corner, lifted the laptop lid. The screen washed the dim room in pale blue light. I pulled up my bank account. People see me flannel shirt Chevy Silverado with rust on the bumper, and they form a picture. They see a man who handles his own yard work, a man who hunts discount codes for a bag of coffee. They have constructed an entire story about me, and every word of it is wrong. 30 years ago, I built a construction supply company out of nothing. I read land the way other men read box scores, bought it, overlooked, sold it when the world caught up. Today I hold 3 apartment complexes and a commercial warehouse district. I walked away from the day-to-day 5 years back, but the income never stopped. Derek has decided I scrape by, on a pension. He figures the card in his wallet runs on a $5,000 ceiling, and that covering it strains me. He genuinely believes that $85,000 represented everything I'd put away across a lifetime. He thinks he has been hollowing me out and that love makes me blind to it. Wrong on every count. I pulled up the transaction history to inventory exactly what my working class dollars had been funding. The list scrolled longer than it had any right to. Every line was an insult. $4,000 at Tranquil Day Spa 2 days ago. Lacey and her mother going for the full treatment, I'd guess. $4,000 more than I've spent on myself in the last 4 years combined. $12,000 to American Airlines. First-class tickets from Boston for Lacey's parents. Derek assured me they had money. Rich people, he said. Then why is it my account that covered their airfare? Why am I bankrolling their trip so they can arrive and regard me as beneath them $3,000 at the Ivory Lounge? Last night, the rehearsal dinner I was told nothing about. Derek said it was bridal party only. The receipt said 20 people. 20 guests working through steak and lobster on my tab, while I sat alone eating a turkey sandwich in my kitchen. I kept scrolling. $500 to a limousine company. Morning pickup at the airport. For the well-heeled parents who apparently can't sort out their own transportation. Then the one that dwarfed everything else, pending $85,000. The sterling grand. I sat with that figure. That number is a college degree. It's a mortgage paid off in certain zip codes. That is the marrow of 40 years of labor, being spent on a celebration I'd been told to stay away from. I checked when the transfer had gone out. Yesterday morning. ACH transfer. People assume that means immediate. It doesn't work that way. Funds need time to move through the system. And inside that window, that narrow corridor of time, the originating party can pull the authorization back. Grounds required error or fraud. This qualified. Fraud of the deepest kind, the kind that happens between people who are supposed to love each other. I set my hand on the mouse. It didn't tremble. I found the $85,000 line and clicked it. A menu unfolded. Dispute transaction. The site wanted a reason. I entered a single word unauthorized. Nothing dishonest about that. I had signed off on funding a wedding. I had not signed off on funding a social function that had me banned at the door. The agreement between father and son, the unspoken contract, had been torn up first. I hit submit. The page reloaded. Transaction canceled. The money would sit right where it was. Come morning, the Sterling Grand system would flag the payment as failed. I wasn't through. Credit card tab next. The card living in Derek's wallet, the one he pulled out whenever he wanted Lacey to see a certain version of him. The one he used to purchase her admiration. I looked at what he owed. $20,000 run up in a single month. Flowers, tailoring, jewelry. I navigated to manage authorized users. Derek Kowalczyk. A toggle beside his name active. I clicked it over to inactive. Then I sat there and thought about it. I wanted certainty, the kind you can't second guess later. Certainty that tomorrow, when he reached for that card to cover the florist, or the makeup team, or the last round at the bar, it would perform exactly like a piece of dead plastic. I clicked report, lost, or stolen. The site asked whether I wanted a replacement card sent out. I clicked no. I pushed back in my chair and let the quiet settle around me. Inside my skull, though, I could hear a blade falling. I shut the browser. Then I pulled up my email. There was one waiting from the property manager for the house on Elmwood Drive, the house Derek and Lacey live in. They believe they rent from a management company. What they don't know is that I'm the one who holds the deed. I bought it through an LLC 3 years back, so they'd have somewhere decent to live. I've been keeping their rent artificially low the whole time. They hand over $1,000 a month. Going rate in that neighborhood is $3,000. I've been quietly covering the gap, moving money from one pocket to the other. I typed out a message to the property manager. His name is Rafferty, my lawyer and a friend going back decades. Subject line eviction notice. Rafferty prepare a 30-day notice for the tenants on Elmwood Drive, and effective immediately on any lease renewal. Bring the rent to market value. No special treatment. Get it out tomorrow morning. Hank. I hit send. That was that. In under 10 minutes, I'd pulled the floor out from under the financial world my son had been happily floating through. I shut the laptop. A strange feeling moved through me. I expected guilt. A father's instinct is to shield his child, but a father's duty is also to raise one. I had not taught Derek what gratitude looked like. I had not taught him what respect cost. So life was going to step in and handle the curriculum, and life doesn't grade on a curve. I went back to the kitchen. I rinsed the bourbon glass and set it in the drying rack, tucked the leather conditioner away under the sink. Then my phone started going. I walked over and looked at the screen. Derek calling. He was probably at a bar somewhere running out the last hours of his bachelor life. Or maybe a card had just come back, declined mid-round. The screen showed his face, a photo from a fishing trip 5 years ago, both of us grinning. We looked like we were on the same side. I watched the phone dance on the table. Buzz, 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 then quiet. A text appeared. Dad, call me back. My card isn't working. I read it twice. Not a word about whether I was all right. No mention of the message he'd sent earlier that night telling me to stay home from his wedding. He reached out only because the money pipeline had gone dry. That told me everything. I held the power button on the side of the phone until the screen went dark and the spinning wheel faded out. I switched off the kitchen light. I walked the hallway toward the bedroom. The wall was lined with photographs. Elaine's face, Derek in his graduation cap, snapshots of a life I thought I understood. I lay down on top of the covers. The sheets were cool against my back. I pulled the blanket to my chin. Tomorrow was going to be a wreck for Derek Kowalczyk. He'd wake up and wrestle himself into a tuxedo he probably hadn't finished paying for. He'd roll up to a venue that was expecting $85,000 that was never arriving. He'd stand in front of Lacey's high society family, holding a dead credit card and a story that was fixing to collapse under him. And I would not be there with a shovel to dig him out. I let my eyes close. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't carrying my son's future around in my chest. I had done what a father could do. I drifted off to the sound of wind pushing against the windows. It had the feel of a storm gathering, and it was. But this time the storm wasn't pointed at my roof. It was pointed at his. The morning sun was just starting to burn through the haze that lay over the trimmed lawns of my neighborhood. 7 in the morning on the day my son was supposed to get married. Most fathers in my position would be knotting a tie, or glancing at a watch, or sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a coffee and turning over the words of a toast. I was in the front yard yanking the pull cord on my 25-year-old Craftsman lawn mower. The engine coughed twice, then caught a deep rattling roar that tore through the morning quiet. I loved that sound. It meant something was working the way it was supposed to. That machine had never once let me down, which put it ahead of certain people who were going to be showing up before long. I tugged my cap down over my eyes and started pushing across the grass. Gasoline fumes and the clean bite of cut clover rose up around me. It steadied something in my chest, reminded me of who I was. I was Hank Kowalczyk. I built things from nothing. I fixed what was broken, and today I was in the business of tearing something down. I was midway through the second row when I heard the squeal high-performance tires, punished against dry pavement. I didn't break stride, kept my hands on the mower, kept moving, feeling the vibration travel up through my palms. But I recognized that sound. I knew the engine note underneath it. Mercedes E-Class, a black sedan that cost north of $9,000. I knew the exact figure because I was the one who signed for it 2 years back. when Derek said he needed dependable transportation for client visits. The black sedan came around the corner at a speed that had no business on a residential street, then locked up its brakes at the foot of my driveway. The tires laid down twin black stripes across the pavement I'd sealed with my own hands last summer. I let the mower idle, didn't kill the engine, just leaned against the handle with my arms crossed and waited. The driver's door swung open hard. Derek stumbled out. He looked hollowed out, unwashed hair going in several directions at once, wrinkled t-shirt, sweatpants. Not a trace of the man who was supposed to marry into high society in a few hours. He looked like a kid who'd just woken up to find everything had gone sideways. Then the passenger door opened. Lacey climbed out in a coral linen tracksuit that probably ran more than my mower and sunglasses, big enough to cover half her face. She put the door back so hard the whole car shifted on its springs. That tightened something in my jaw. You don't slam the door on a car you didn't pay for. You don't slam the door on anything that belongs to Hank. She was already screaming before she'd taken 3 steps. Her voice cut right through the engine rumble. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I reached down and flipped the kill switch. The mower went quiet. The silence that replaced it had weight. I pulled one slow breath, gasoline and grass, before I turned to face them. I fished the chamois cloth from my back pocket and dragged it across my forehead. I didn't offer a word. I just looked at the two of them. Derek scrambled up the driveway, his shoes sliding on the loose clippings. "Dad," he said, catching his breath a few feet from me. "Dad, you have to answer your phone. Why is it off? Do you understand what's happening right now?" I met his eyes without changing my expression. "I'm cutting the grass, Derek. I like to concentrate when I work." Lacey came up behind him, eyes fixed on her phone, thumbs hammering the screen. Then she turned it around and shoved it at my face. "Declined," she said, her voice dropping into something sharp and tight. "Declined. Do you know what declined means, Hank? I was at the salon. I was already in the chair. They'd just finished the extensions. My hair was still damp. I handed over the card and the machine beeped. It beeped loud. The whole place went still. The stylist, the other women waiting, everybody looked up. She moved in closer, cutting into my space. She carried the smell of chemical treatments and barely held together composure. "It came up stolen," she said, dropping her voice like the word itself was dirty. The machine flagged the card as stolen. They looked at me like I was a criminal. They threatened to bring the police into it, Hank. I had to get my father on the phone to pay them. My father, on my wedding morning. I folded the cloth and slid it back into my pocket. "That sounds humiliating," I said. "No heat in it whatsoever?" Humiliating, her voice jumped an octave. "It was a disaster. You need to get on the phone with the bank this minute. Tell them it was your mistake. Tell them you hit the wrong thing. Make it right." Derek wedged himself between his palms out, trying to bring the temperature down. "Dad, please. We're out of time here. The florist needs the final payment. The car service needs their deposit before the airport pickup. We've got vendors lined up waiting on money this morning. Just turn the card back on. Whatever's going on with you, we'll sit down after the wedding and sort it out. Whatever's going on with me." He let that float there in the air between us like it was a minor grievance, a bad mood, something a good night's sleep might fix. He thought this was a senior moment, some confused old man fumbling with his phone. He had no idea the earth had already moved under him. I studied my son's face. What I saw there wasn't concern for me. It was the look of a man whose supply had just been cut off. "I'm not calling the bank," I said. Derek blinked. "What?" "You heard me. I'm not calling the bank. The card didn't get declined by accident. Derek, I reported it stolen." Lacey made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. "You what? Why on earth would you do that?" "Because I figured something out last night," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "I figured out that only a thief takes $85,000 from a man and then tells him he's not fit to sit at the same table." The color drained from Derek's face. He'd caught up. This wasn't a system error. This was deliberate. "Dad, come on." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "You got the text. Look, I'm sorry. All right? It's complicated. Lacey's family operates differently. They have certain expectations. We just wanted the day to go smoothly. We didn't want you feeling out of place." "Out of place," I said back to him, letting the words hang there. "You are standing in the driveway of the house I built. You are driving the car I purchased. The clothes on your back, I paid for those, and you think I'm the one who doesn't belong here." Lacey scoffed and tilted her head, the dark lenses of her glasses catching the sun. "Oh, here we go." The martyr routine. Listen, Hank, we don't have time for your blue-collar pity party. We have guests coming in from Cape Cod. We have a schedule to keep. You're burning everything down because your ego took a bruise. Hand over the money and go back to your yard work. You're right, you don't fit with my family. Look at yourself. You've got grass all over you. You look like the help. The help. I dropped my eyes to my boots. Old work boots, oil-stained, caked with mud around the soles. I glanced at my flannel shirt, faded thin at both elbows. Then I looked past them at the Mercedes, sitting at the curb. That car had meant something to me when I arranged it. I'd taken on 6 extra months of consulting work just to pay cash outright, so Derek would never carry a car payment. I kept the title in my name for insurance reasons, but I handed him the keys and let him play the role of the man who owned it. You know, Lacey, I said, my voice dropping a register, you're absolutely right. I am the help. I'm the help that covers your rent. I'm the help that funds your vacations. And I'm the help that owns the car you just rattled on its springs, slamming the door. I stepped around them and walked down the driveway toward the street. Where are you going? Derek's voice climbed higher. Dad, where are you going? I moved to the Mercedes and ran my palm across the hood. The metal was warm from the engine. I crouched slightly and looked at the tires. Continental Sport Contacts, $450 a corner. Those were mine too. I reached into my pocket for my key ring. I keep a spare for everything I own. I hit the button. The locks clicked. The lights flashed. I pulled open the driver's door. Dad, what are you doing? Derek was moving toward me now at a near jog. We need that car. We have to collect the groomsmen in an hour. I lowered myself into the seat. The leather wrapped around me soft and broken in. It carried the scent of Derek's cologne layered over Lacey's perfume. It smelled like a life built on someone else's labor. I turned the key. The engine came alive and the dash illuminated. Get out of that car, Hank! Lacey was sprinting down the driveway, her heels cracking against the concrete with each step. That is our car. You can't do this. I put the window down as they converged on either side. Derek had both hands on the doorframe knuckles, bloodless from gripping. It's not your car, Derek, I said. It was never your car. My name is on the title. My name is on the policy. And since I'm not welcome at the wedding, I don't see why my car should be. Dad, you can't... Derek's voice broke apart. How are we supposed to get to the venue? How are we supposed to go anywhere? I genuinely don't know, I said, sliding the car into gear. Maybe reach out to Lacey's father. A man of his standing probably has a spare car service on call. Or there's the bus. Very practical. Very working class. I didn't give them a chance to answer. I pressed the accelerator and the car pulled forward, leaving the two of them planted in the street. I checked the mirror on my way out. Derek stood with his arms dead at his sides, looking hollowed out. Lacey had both hands raised toward the sky, screaming at the space where the car had been. I drove around the block and pulled into my garage. The door came down behind me. I went back inside and turned the deadbolt. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of coffee. My hands had a slight tremor, not nerves, adrenaline. The opening move was done, but the game had a long way to run. I sat at the table and watched the phone light up. Not Derek this time. The landline. I let it go. I already knew their next move. They'd head for the apartment, try to pull themselves together, start hunting for anything they could liquidate for quick cash. They were walking back toward the house on Elmwood Drive. What they didn't know was that a locksmith was arriving there in exactly 20 minutes. I took a sip of coffee. Bitter exactly how I take it. It was shaping up to be a long day, and for the first time in years, I was eager for what was coming. They had wanted a spectacle, a flawless high society affair. I was going to hand them a spectacle they wouldn't stop talking about. I was going to show them precisely what happens when the help walks off the job. The phone went quiet. The silence came back, but it wasn't the restful kind. It was the silence of a fuse eating itself down to the charge. I got up and went to the window. They were still visible down the street, moving away from my house. Arguing. Lacey shoving Derek. Derek reaching for her arm and missing. From up here they looked small, petty and small. They were making their way toward the bus stop. I almost felt something close to sorry for them almost. Then the text came back to me. Don't come. You're too working class? I turned away from the glass. There was something I needed to do. I had a wedding to attend uninvited, and if I was going to be cast as the villain in their story, I intended to be the best-dressed villain they'd ever laid eyes on. I went to the closet and lifted out the navy suit. I set it across the bed and smoothed the fabric with the flat of my hand. Good material, built to last, just like me. The rules of the game had changed on them while they weren't paying attention. They just didn't know it yet. I was standing in my kitchen, letting the quiet fill the room when the pounding started. Less than 10 minutes after I'd taken the Mercedes back. A frantic, heavy thudding against the front door that shook the frame with each blow. They hadn't gone to the bus stop after all. They'd come back. Because without me, they were marooned in the suburbs. No funds, no car, and a ceremony start time that was closing in fast. I finished the last of my coffee, set the mug in the sink. I walked to the door at my own pace. I wasn't rushing anymore. I was finished rushing for people who wouldn't lift a finger for me. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Derek was on the step chest working hard, sweat glazing his face. Behind him stood Lacey, arms locked across her chest, her coral linen tracksuit looking absurd against the weathered paint of my porch railing. She looked like a bird of paradise dropped into a hardware store. "You have to stop this, Dad," Derek said, his voice fraying at the edges. "You've gone too far. It was one text. It was just a request. We didn't set out to hurt you, but you're behaving like you've lost your mind. Give us the keys. Turn the card back on. We've got less than an hour before the ceremony." I filled the doorway and rested a shoulder against the frame. I looked at my son, 28 years old, standing there like a child, mid-tantrum, in the middle of a store. "I haven't lost my mind, Derek," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I'm acting like a man who just held on to $85,000. Lacey shoved past Derek and planted herself in front of me. Her face had twisted into something ugly, the filler around her mouth pulling tight with a sneer. "Listen to me, you selfish old man," she said. "You think this is entertainment? You think you can hold us over a barrel? You're pathetic. This is my wedding, my day, and you are torching it because you are too thin-skinned to handle the truth." "And what exactly is the truth, Lacey?" I asked. "The truth is that you are an embarrassment." She shot back, her voice rising. "Look at yourself. Look at this place. It reeks of grease and sawdust. Your clothes came off a clearance rack. You drive a truck that should have been scrapped years ago. My parents are refined people. They are flying in from Boston. They move in circles you couldn't get within a mile of. Do you honestly think I want them seeing you next to us in photographs? Do you think I want to explain to my friends that my father-in-law digs ditches for a living?" I let her words land. She threw them to wound, to cut something loose in me. They didn't wound me. They just brought everything into focus. They burned off the last trace of doubt I was carrying. "I don't dig ditches, Lacey," I said. "I own the company that digs the ditches and the company that pours the concrete and the company that builds the walls. But you never had any interest in that. The only thing you ever looked at was the checkbook." "I don't care what you own," she said, her voice dropping to something cold. "You are low-class Hank, always have been, cheap, tacky, and honestly, we were doing you a favor by including you at all. But now you are going to fix what you've broken. You are going to hand over the money because you owe it to Derek. You owe him a future." "I owe him nothing," I said. "I already gave him everything. I gave him a life. I gave him an education. I gave him a roof. And what did he give me back? A text message telling me to stay home." Derek tried to slide between us. "She didn't mean it like that, Dad. She's just under enormous pressure." "Oh, stop it, Derek," Lacey snapped, waving him off. "Stop making excuses for him. He needs to hear this straight." She turned back to me, eyes burning. "You're going to cover this wedding, Hank. You are going to pay for every single cent of it, because if you don't, I will make certain you never lay eyes on your son again. I will make sure you end your days alone in this miserable little house." I looked at her. I looked at the greed and entitlement coming off her in waves like heat rising off summer asphalt. And then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the night before. "What?" I said. "What?" she snapped. "Why should I fund a party I'm not permitted to attend?" She blinked. The question seemed to throw her off balance. "Because it is your duty," she said. "Because that is what parents do. They pay." "No," I said. "Parents provide, fools pay, and I'm finished being a fool." I reached into my pocket and drew out my phone. Old model cracked screen. Lacey looked at it the way she looked at everything that didn't cost enough. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making a call," I said. I unlocked it and scrolled through my contacts. I don't keep many numbers, but everyone I have is worth keeping. I pulled up Premier Coach Service. I knew the owner personally. His name was Gio. We'd sat across a poker table from each other for 20 years. I put it on speaker and held the phone up between us. Lacey's eyes moved to the screen. She recognized the name. The line rang once, twice. "Hank!" Gio's voice filled the porch. "Good to hear from you. We're all set for the pickup, everything on schedule." "Hello, Gio," I said, keeping my gaze on Lacey's face as I spoke. "I'm calling about the reservation for the Kowalczyk wedding, the stretch Hummer, and the 2 town cars for the airport run." "Yes, sir," Gio said. "My drivers are at Detroit Metro right now. The flight from Boston just touched down. We're waiting on the party at baggage claim." I watched the color slide out of Lacey's face. Her parents, her polished, well-heeled parents, were right now rolling their luggage toward a driver holding a sign with their name on it. "Gio," I said, "there's been a change." "What kind of change, Hank?" "I need you to cancel the service." "Cancel it?" He sounded like he'd misheard me. "Hank, my drivers are already in the terminal. The clock is running." "I know," I said. "Bill me for the cancellation. Whatever the fee is, put it on my account. But pull your drivers. Don't pick up those passengers." "You sure about this, Hank?" Gio said. "It's a wedding day." "I'm certain, Gio," I said. "The card my son listed for incidentals has been reported stolen, and I'm pulling my personal guarantee on the contract. Send your people home." A pause, then a slow exhale on the other end. "All right, Hank, your call. I'll radio them to clear the terminal now. Sorry for the hassle." "No hassle at all. I appreciate it." I ended the call. The silence that settled after that was a different animal entirely. Not a fuse burning, this was the silence on the other side of the blast. Lacey made a sound that didn't belong in a human throat, a raw, strangled shriek of panic. "You didn't—" She breathed, both hands flying to her face. "You did not just leave my parents stranded at Detroit Metro?" I slid the phone back into my pocket. "I did," I said. "They're sophisticated people, Lacey. I'm sure they can manage Uber, or the rail line runs straight into downtown, clean, efficient, very working class. My parents do not use public transportation." She screamed and came at me. Derek grabbed her around the middle, hauling her back. She clawed at the air between us, reaching for something to destroy. "You monster. You have ruined everything. They are going to be standing on a curb like they've been abandoned. They will hate me. They will hate you." "They don't know me," I said, "and from the way you describe me to people, I'd wager they already do. So I've given up nothing." Derek looked at me with something broken behind his eyes. "Dad, how could you do this? They're guests. This is humiliating." "Humiliating?" I repeated. "Humiliating is sitting at your kitchen table polishing your shoes for a wedding you were ordered to skip. Humiliating is understanding that your son is ashamed of the hands that raised him. What's happening here isn't humiliation, Derek. This is a lesson." "A lesson?" His voice cracked into a shout. "You're dismantling my life to make a point." "I'm dismantling the fiction you've been living in," I said. "You wanted to be the big shot Derek. You wanted to marry into royalty. Well, big shots carry their own weight, and royalty doesn't ride on borrowed money." Lacey stopped fighting against Derek's hold. She straightened up, smoothed the front of her coral linen tracksuit, and when she looked at me again, the panic had gone cold. Calculated. "Fine," she said. "You want to make this ugly, Hank? We can make this ugly. You think cutting us off breaks us. You think we'll fold. We don't need you. We have the house on Elmwood Drive. We have the wedding gifts coming in. We'll sort this out ourselves. And when we do, you are finished. You will never see us again. You will never know your grandchildren. You will die in this crumbling house, and not a soul will mourn you." I looked at her, not with anger, with something closer to sadness. "The house on Elmwood Drive," I said. "Yes," she snapped. "Our house." I checked my watch. 8:15. "You'd better head over there," I said. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharpening with suspicion. "Because at 8 IRO this morning, a locksmith met the property manager there," I said. "The locks have been changed. The lease was month to month and held in my name, so I terminated it." Derek's hands dropped away from her waist. He looked like a man who'd just taken a round to the chest. "You evicted us," he said quietly. "I didn't evict you," I said. "I stopped subsidizing people who made clear they aren't family. You said it yourself, Lacey. I'm just a bank account. The bank is closed." Lacey stared at me. Her mouth moved, but nothing came out. It was landing now, all of it at once. No car, no venue, no car service for her parents, no home. Derek stepped back. He looked at the house he'd grown up in, the walls his father had built. He looked at me. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Real fear. The fear of a man who feels the floor give way beneath him. "You've lost your mind," he said. "You are actually out of your mind." "Leave," I said and pointed toward the street. "Go find Lacey's parents. Go explain why they're standing at the airport. Go find somewhere to sleep tonight, but get off my property." I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. I turned the deadbolt. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood. My heart was slamming in my chest. It hurt. God, it hurt to do that to my own boy, to see the hatred burning in his eyes. But then I looked down at my hands, the hands that had built everything from nothing. They were shaking, not from weakness, from rage, from the slow release of years spent making myself small so he could feel large. I crossed to the window and watched them. They were scrambling down the driveway. Derek was on his phone, probably trying to call a ride he had no money to pay for. Lacey was screaming at him, pounding on his arm. They looked like rats on a sinking ship, turning on one another as the water closed in. I watched until they rounded the corner and vanished. I was alone in my house. The silence that settled was clean silence. The air felt lighter somehow. I went back to the kitchen. I picked up the leather conditioner again. I still had one shoe left to finish. I wasn't going to the wedding, but that was no reason to go without polished shoes. A man stays ready because I knew this wasn't over. They would go to the Elmwood Drive house. They would find the locks changed, and then they would discover that the paintings on the walls, the paintings my wife Elaine had done, were gone. That was when the real war would begin. I dipped the worn chamois cloth into the wax. Circular strokes, patience, focus. I was just getting started. I drove to the house on Elmwood Drive. It was a 20-minute drive from my place past the strip malls and the new developments that had swallowed up the cornfields I'd run through as a boy. I parked the Chevy Silverado across the street. The place looked good. I had re-sided it myself 3 years back, going with sage green fiber cement siding that was expensive but lasted forever. The lawn was green, the windows were clean. It was a perfect starter home, the kind most young couples would have killed for, and I had handed it to them at studio apartment rent. I spotted them before I even cut the engine. They were standing on the front porch. Lacey was hammering on the door with the flat of her hands, screaming at the wood like it could answer her. Derek was pacing the front walkway, both hands buried in his hair, looking like a man who had just watched everything burn down. They hadn't gone to the airport. They hadn't gone to a hotel. They had come here banking on a bluff, hoping the key still in Derek's pocket would still turn the tumbler. It didn't. Rafferty is a good property manager. When he says 8 sirs, he means 8 sirs. I stepped out of the truck. I didn't slam the door. I pressed it shut until it clicked. That sound made Derek look up. When he saw me, his expression shifted entirely. The fear I'd caught in his eyes earlier was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly fury. He didn't see his father anymore. He saw the enemy. He saw the man standing between him and the life he believed he was owed. He started toward me at a run. No scream. No shout. Just head down and charging. I had seen that look before in bar fights and disputes on job sites when the money dried up. It was the look of a man who has lost all control and wants to hurt something just to prove he still exists. I held my ground. I didn't flinch. I reached into the bed of the truck, and my hand closed around the cold rubber grip of a pair of long-handled pruning shears. I tossed them in there yesterday after trimming hedges at one of my rental properties. They were heavy, solid steel blades, sharp enough to take a finger off clean. I pulled them free and let them hang at my side. I didn't raise them like a weapon. I held them the way you hold a tool you know exactly how to use. Derek crossed the street. He didn't slow. He was going to hit me. My own son was going to tackle me onto the asphalt. I took one step forward and snapped the blades shut. Clack! The sound was sharp and metallic, splitting the morning air like a gunshot. Derek skidded to a stop 6 feet out. He stared at the shears. Then his eyes came up to my face. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't angry. I was cold. I looked at him the way a foreman looks at a worker he catches stealing copper wire. I looked at him with the eyes of a man who has let bigger and meaner people go without blinking. "Don't," I said. My voice was low, barely above a whisper, but he heard every word. "Do not take another step, Derek." He stood there, chest-heaving, fists balled at his sides. "You locked us out." He choked saliva spraying from his lips. "All our stuff is in there. My suit, Lacey's dress for the reception, our passports. Everything You can't do this. It is illegal. It is not illegal, I said evenly. It is a lockout for non-payment of market value rent and lease violation. Rafferty posted the notice on the door. Didn't you read it? I don't care about the notice, he screamed, stepping forward again. Open the door, Dad. Open the damn door, or I swear to God I will... He raised a fist. I lifted the shears. I pointed the blades straight at his chest. My arm didn't waver, steady as a post. You will what, Derek? I asked. You will hit me. You will beat up the old man. Go ahead, try it. But remember who taught you how to fight, and remember that I spent 40 years breaking concrete while you were playing video games. He froze. He looked at the blades, then at my eyes. He found something there he had never seen before. He saw that the safety net was gone. He saw that I wasn't his dad anymore. I was just another man, and in a contest between men he knew he would lose. The rage drained out of him and left him hollow. He took a step back, his hands trembling. You are crazy, he whispered. You are actually threatening me. I am not threatening you, I said, lowering the shears but keeping them ready. I am protecting myself. There is a difference. Lacey came running across the lawn, her heels punching down into the grass I had paid to have fertilized. She grabbed Derek's arm and yanked him back. Derek, stop! She cried, staring at me with genuine terror. He has lost his mind. Look at him. He has a weapon. We have to go. We can call the police later. We have to get to the venue. My parents are probably there already. We have to salvage this. She was right. The clock was running. Every minute they burned standing here was a minute closer to their social funeral. I watched them fall back. They retreated toward the sidewalk like I was something rabid. Listen to me, I called out, my voice carrying down the street. I'm giving you 24 hours. They stopped and looked back. 24 hours, I repeated. Rafferty will be here tomorrow at noon. He will open the door for exactly 60 minutes. You can take your clothes and your personal items. Anything still in there after that goes to the dump. But the furniture, Lacey wailed. The TV, the wedding gifts. The furniture is mine, I said. I bought it. The TV is mine. I bought it. The gifts, well, you can take the gifts. You are going to need them to return for cash once you realize you have nowhere to sleep. I took one step toward them and they both flinched. Now get out of here, I said. Get off my street. Go play pretend with your rich in-laws. See how far that gets you. Derek looked at me one final time. There was no love left in his eyes, only hate. Pure, undiluted hate. And that was fine. I could live with hate. What I couldn't live with was disrespect. Come on, Lacey, he said, taking her hand. Let's go. We will fix this. We don't need him. They turned and ran toward the main road, probably hoping to flag down a cab or find a signal strong enough to call a ride they couldn't afford. I watched them go. I stood there in the street with the pruning shears in my hand, feeling the weight of the steel. Across the way, Mrs. Pruitt peered out from behind her curtains. I nodded at her. She let the curtain drop. I turned and walked up the driveway. I went to the front door. I looked at the notice Rafferty had taped there. Notice of lease termination. It looked official. It looked final. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the master key. I didn't need to wait for Rafferty. I owned the place. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air in the house was stale. It smelled of expensive candles and neglect. Clothes were thrown everywhere. Pizza boxes covered the coffee table. It looked like a frat house, not a home for a married couple. I walked through the living room. I didn't look at the mess. I looked at the walls. There were empty spaces, rectangular patches where the paint was a shade brighter than everything around them. I stopped cold. My heart lurched. I moved to the hallway. More empty spaces. I went to the bedroom. Above the bed where I had hung it myself 3 years ago, there should have been a painting. A landscape of the lake cabin we used to rent every summer. Elaine had painted it the summer before she got sick. To the world it was nothing special. To me it was everything. It was her soul pressed onto canvas. It was gone. I searched the room in a panic. The painting of the flowers gone. The sketch of Derek as a boy gone. I crossed to the jewelry box on the dresser. Open, empty. Elaine's pearl necklace, the one I had given her for our 30th anniversary. Gone. My blood went cold. Then it boiled. They hadn't just been living off me. They had been selling me off piece by piece. I looked down at the floor. Half tucked under the bed was a slip of paper. I picked it up. It was a receipt. Yellow carbon copy. Midtown pawn and lone gold items. 3 oil paintings. Amateur artist. 1 pearl necklace. 1 gold watch. Total cash payout, $1,200. I stood there staring at that number. Batar 200. They had sold my wife's legacy. Sold the only pieces of her I had left, probably to upgrade the floral arrangements or hire a better DJ. The sadness left me. The hesitation left me. This was no longer about a wedding. This was no longer about disrespect. This was a crime. I took out my phone and called Rafferty. Hank, he answered. I changed the locks. They're out. I know Rafferty, I said. My voice was trembling, but not from fear. I'm inside the house. I need you to do something for me, and I need it done quickly. What is it, Hank? Draft a criminal complaint. Theft. Grand larceny. Hank, are you sure it's your son? I looked at the bare patch on the wall where Elaine's painting used to hang. I reached out and touched it. The wall was cold. He isn't my son right now, I said. He is a thief. Prepare the papers and call the police. Tell them to meet me at the Sterling Grand. You're going to the wedding? Rafferty asked. Yes, I said. I'm going to the wedding. I have a gift to deliver. I hung up. I tucked the receipt into my pocket, walked out of the house, and locked the door behind me. I got in the truck. I had work to do. Oh, I pulled the Chevy Silverado up to the curb in front of the house on Elmwood Drive and cut the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that tends to settle in just before a storm breaks. I sat there for a moment, hands wrapped around the steering wheel, studying the house. It was a good house, a solid house. I had bought it out of foreclosure 3 years back and spent 6 months rebuilding it with my own hands. I sanded the floors, I hung the drywall, I put in the new windows. It was supposed to be a gift, a foothold, a place for Derek and Lacey to build something real. Now it felt like a fortress that had been sealed against me. I climbed out and walked up the driveway. The concrete was marked with oil stains Derek had never thought to clean. I dug out my keyring, found the brass key, the master key I'd kept back for emergencies, and slid it into the lock. It went in halfway and stopped. I worked it. I applied pressure. It hit solid metal. They had changed the locks. I stood there on the porch staring at the deadbolt. A short, humorless sound came out of me. Pure disbelief. They lived in my house, rent-free. They drove my cars. They spent my money. And when things got difficult, their answer was to lock me out of property they didn't own. There was a kind of audacity there that almost made me pause to admire it. They genuinely believed that possession was 9/10 of the law. They genuinely believed that if they kept me on the outside, they could hold the fantasy together. I took out my phone. I didn't call Derek. I didn't call Lacey. Shouting through a locked door wouldn't accomplish anything. Instead, I scrolled to a number I hadn't used in a while. Reuben the locksmith picked up on the second ring. Hank, he said, what can I do for you? I need you at Elmwood Drive, Reuben, I said. Bring the drill and bring a new set of deadbolts, the heavy-duty ones. I waited on the porch. I didn't pace. I didn't peer through the windows. I stood there like a sentry. Neighbors crept by in their cars slowing when they spotted me standing guard in my work clothes. I didn't wave. I had no interest in pleasantries right now. I was interested in access. Reuben arrived in 15 minutes. Big man. 30 years of cracking locks and pulling safes in this city. He looked at me, looked at the door, and didn't ask a single question. He knew who held the deed. He knew who paid the bills. Lose your keys, Hank, he asked, lifting a heavy drill from the back of his van. Something like that, I said. The tenants made some unauthorized modifications. I need to inspect the property. Reuben nodded and stepped up to the door. The drill shrieked as it chewed through the lock pins, the ones Derek had probably paid good money to have installed just hours earlier. Metal shavings curled onto the welcome mat. It took under 2 minutes. A final crunch, and the lock gave way. Reuben worked a screwdriver through the mechanism, and the door swung open. Thanks, Reuben, I said, pressing a wad of cash into his hand. Install the new ones. Give me the only set of keys. I stepped inside. The smell reached me first, a thick, suffocating blend of flat champagne, expensive perfume, and old garbage. The smell of a party that had run too long and ended badly. The blinds were pulled shut, dropping the living room into a dim, stale half-light. I found the light switch. What it revealed was absolute devastation. Not the violent destruction of a single moment, something slower and more damning than that. A casual, grinding disrespect that had been applied to every surface day after day. Clothes were strewn across everything, designer jackets draped over chair backs, silk dresses pooled on the floor like spilled liquid. Towers of shoe boxes leaned against the walls at precarious angles. Take-out containers covered the coffee table, some of them drawing flies. I moved further into the room and felt something crunch beneath my boot. I looked down. A crystal champagne flute ground to pieces on the floor. I stepped over it. This was how they actually lived. This was the truth lurking behind the polished Instagram photos and the high society performance. They existed like squatters in a palace, treating my property exactly the way they treated me, with total indifference to its worth. I went into the kitchen. The sink was buried under dishes. A bottle of Dom Perignon sat uncorked on the counter, going flat in the warmth of the room. I looked at the granite countertops I had laid myself. Ring marks, stains. One of the cabinet doors hung loose from a single hinge. A cold fury climbed through my chest. This wasn't just clutter. This was ingratitude made visible. Every stain, every scratch, every piece of discarded trash was proof of how little any of this had meant to them. Then I noticed something that made all of it seem beside the point. I walked back into the living room and looked at the walls. When I had handed them the house, I had left a few things behind, mostly furniture, but also some art. Elaine had been a painter. Not a professional, but she had a gift for catching light in a way that made the world seem gentler. She had painted the places we had traveled to together, the lakes, the mountains, the quiet corners of the world where we had been happy. I looked at the space above the fireplace, a large rectangular patch cleaner and brighter than the surrounding wall. The painting of the lighthouse in Maine was gone. I turned around, the wall by the hallway, the wildflower field, gone. My heart began to pound against my ribs, not the frantic beat of panic, the slow, heavy thud of dread. I ran down the hallway, kicking the pile of laundry out of my path. I shoved open the door to the master bedroom. The bed was unmade, a heap of expensive sheets twisted across the mattress. Suitcases lay open on the floor, half packed, as though someone had been pulled away mid-task. But I wasn't thinking about that. My eyes went to the wall above the dresser, Elaine's self-portrait, the one she had painted for me on our 25th anniversary, the one where she wore that private smile, the smile she saved only for me. It was gone. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly in a full circle. The walls were bare. Every piece of art, every trace of my wife had been stripped away. The hooks remained small, naked, accusatory. I lunged for the closet. I threw the doors open. I wrenched open the drawers of the jewelry cabinet I had built into the wall with my own hands. Empty. Elaine's pearl necklace, her diamond earrings, the gold watch I had given her the year Derek was born, all of it gone. The air in the room felt thin. I could barely get a breath. They hadn't merely lived off me. They hadn't simply disrespected me. They had looted me. They had taken the only fragments of Elaine I had left, the pieces I had trusted them to look after, and they had stripped them away. But why take the paintings? They weren't famous works. They had no market value to speak of. They were memory. They were family. Unless they needed cash in a hurry. Unless they needed money to cover the flowers and the limousine and the champagne tower at a wedding I hadn't been invited to. I dropped to my knees. I tore through the room. I ripped the sheets from the bed. I upended the suitcases onto the floor. I was searching for something, anything that could tell me what had happened and when. The nightstand drawers held nothing but loose change and scraps of paper. Receipts. I reached into the trash can beside the bed and grabbed a fistful of crumpled papers. I smoothed them out one by one. Pizza, dry cleaning, a parking ticket, and then I found it. A yellow carbon slip balled up and thrown away like it was worth nothing. I unfolded it. My hands were trembling so badly I could hardly make out the text. The logo at the top was a set of scales. Midtown Pawn and Loan. I read down the itemized list. Item 1, oil painting coastal landscape. Item 2, oil painting floral study. Item 3, oil painting portrait. Item 4, vintage pearl necklace. Item 5, gold lady's watch. I looked at the total payout. Mine 200. They had sold my wife's soul. They had sold 40 years of memory. They had sold the legacy of a woman who had loved Derek more than her own life. And they had done it for $1, $200, probably to cover the appetizers or to upgrade the bridal suite. I sat there on the floor, clutching that yellow slip. The rage that had been burning inside me shifted into something else entirely. It turned to ice. It hardened into a resolve so cold it frightened me. This was no longer a dispute between a father and a son. This was no longer about a wedding invitation or a frozen bank account. This was a crime. I got to my feet. I slid the receipt into my pocket. I took one last look around the room. I didn't see my son's bedroom. I saw a crime scene. I walked out, down the hallway past the locksmith finishing up the new deadbolt installation. Lock it all up, Reuben, I said. My voice was level. Every door. Nobody gets in, not even if they beg. I walked out to the truck. I took out my phone. I dialed. Rafferty picked up on the first ring. Hank, did you get in? He asked. I got in, I said. Rafferty, I need you to do something for me right now. What is it, Hank? I'm holding a receipt from a pawn shop. Derek stole his mother's jewelry. He stole her paintings and he pawned them. A silence on the line. When Rafferty spoke, his voice was grave. Hank, that is grand larceny. If we pursue this, he will go to jail. I looked at the window where Elaine used to stand and wave at me when I pulled into the driveway after work. Draft the complaint, Rafferty, I said. Call the precinct. Tell them I want to press charges and tell them to meet me at the Sterling Grand. You're going to the venue, Rafferty asked. Yes, I said, starting the engine. I'm going to the venue. The police can pick him up there. Hank, think carefully about this, Rafferty said. Doing this at the wedding, that is the nuclear option. I put the truck in gear. They sold Elaine for $1, $200, Rafferty. The nuclear option is the only one I have left. I hung up. I didn't look back at the house. I pointed the truck toward the city. The sun was high and bright. It was a beautiful day for a wedding, and it was a beautiful day for justice. I stood in the middle of that master bedroom, and the silence pressed down like weight. The pale, rectangular outlines on the walls where Elaine's paintings had hung looked like fresh wound scars where the soul of the house used to live. They were voids. They were absences with edges. The tightness in my chest had nothing to do with my heart condition and everything to do with heartbreak. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed to see the full paper trail of their betrayal. I walked over to the desk in the corner, a cheap particle board thing that Lacey had insisted on buying because it looked modern, even though I had offered to build them a proper oak one. The surface was buried under an avalanche of paper. Unopened envelopes, glossy wedding magazines, brochures for luxury honeymoons in the Maldives, a shrine to their own delusion. I started digging. I wasn't careful. I cleared the magazines off with one sweep of my arm. I grabbed fistfuls of mail and tore them open. Past due notice from the electric company. Final warning from the credit card company. A collections letter regarding a personal loan. It was a financial autopsy laid out in paper. They weren't simply broke. They were drowning, suffocating under the weight of a life they couldn't afford. They were using this wedding as one last lungful of air, betting everything on the wedding gifts bailing them out or on the chance that I would die and leave them the rest. I yanked open the top drawer, jammed solid with takeout menus and charging cables. I pulled harder and the whole thing flew off its tracks and hit the floor. There in the dark cavity, beneath where the drawer had been sat a shoebox, an old Nike box. I lifted the lid. Inside a tangle of papers, pawn slips, receipts. My hands weren't steady as I reached in. I took out the first slip, dated 3 months ago. Gold cufflinks engraved HK. My cufflinks, the ones I had given Derek at his college graduation, the ones that had belonged to my father before that. He had pawned them for $200. I pulled out another, 2 months ago. Silver tea set antique. Elaine's tea set. The one her grandmother had carried over from Poland. Gone. Sold for its weight in scrap silver. Bile climbed my throat. I kept digging. I was looking for the most recent one, the slip that would explain the bare walls and the hollow air in every room. I found it at the bottom of the stack. Dated yesterday. The ink was barely dry. Midtown Pawn and Loan. The list was long, a catalog of my wife's life. Item 1, oil painting coastal scene artist, unknown. Item 2, oil painting floral arrangement artist, unknown. Item 3, 18K gold locket with diamond chip. Item 4, pearl necklace, double strand. I stared at the page, the words blurred. The locket. I had bought that for Elaine the night we found out she was pregnant with Derek. I had worked double shifts for 6 months to afford it. I still remembered the evening I gave it to her, the two of us sitting on the floor of our first apartment, eating pizza, because we didn't own a table yet. She had cried. She had worn it every single day from that night forward, right up until she got sick. In the hospital, when her skin had grown too sensitive, she had unclasped it herself and pressed it into my hand. Give this to Derek's wife one day, she had said. Make sure she understands what it means. I had given it to Lacey at the engagement dinner. I had sat across the table from her and told her the whole story. I had told her it was a symbol of enduring love, and she had sold it. She had taken the emblem of my wife's love for her own son and traded it away for cash. I looked at the payout figure on the receipt. Total $1,200. That was it. That was the asking price for my memories. That was what the market said Elaine's legacy was worth. They hadn't done this because they were desperate. They hadn't sold these things to keep the lights on or put food on the table. I looked at the receipt again. It was stapled to a second sheet of paper. An invoice from a florist. Orchid arrangement upgrade for head table $200. I let out a sound that was half laugh. They had traded Elaine's locket for flowers. They had swapped her paintings for centerpieces that would be browning and drooping before the reception was over. They had erased my wife to purchase a few hours of looking wealthy for people who didn't care about them. I lowered myself onto the edge of the unmade bed and held the pawn slip in both hands. The paper felt hot against my skin. For years I had been making excuses for Derek. I told myself he was still young. I told myself the pressure had gotten to him. I told myself he was just finding his footing in a world harder than anything I had known coming up. I told myself that somewhere underneath it all, he was still that little boy who used to trail me around job sites with a plastic toy hammer. But that boy was gone. He had been gone a long time. The man who had occupied this house was a stranger who would steal from his own mother's ghost to impress people he barely knew. I looked up at the empty patch of wall where Elaine's self-portrait used to hang. I could almost see her eyes looking back at me from that spot. She had been the gentle one. She had always urged patience. He is finding his way, Hank, she used to say. Let him make his mistakes. But this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is letting a bill slip through the cracks. A mistake is blurting something cruel in the heat of an argument. This was a decision, deliberate, calculated, made with clear eyes to value an image over a person, to value a party over a parent. This was a violation. I felt the last tether snap, that invisible cord that runs between a father and a son, that thick, heavy rope of unconditional love and duty. It frayed, and then it broke clean. I was no longer a father, not in this room, not with this receipt in my hand. I was a man who had been robbed. I folded the receipt carefully. I pressed the crease until the edges were sharp. I tucked it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, right over my heart. It didn't feel like paper anymore. It felt like evidence. I stood. My knees didn't give me any trouble this time. I felt strong. I felt cold. The sadness had left me. The grief had left me. What remained was a clarity so sharp it could cut glass. I walked to the dresser and picked up a framed photo of Derek and Lacey. They were somewhere on sunglasses on drinks, raised smiling for the camera. They looked perfect. I pulled the photo from the frame. I tore it in half. Then I tore the halves again. I let the pieces drift down to the floor and join the wreckage they had already made of the place. I walked out of the bedroom. I moved down the hallway past the bare walls, the empty spaces, the naked hooks. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I had the receipt. I stepped out the front door and turned the new deadbolt behind me. The click of the lock sounded like a cell door closing. I walked to the truck. The sun was all the way up now, glaring off the hood. A beautiful day, or a perfect day for a wedding. I climbed into the cab and reached for my phone. My hand was steady. I scrolled to Rafferty's number. I wasn't calling him to complain. I wasn't calling to vent. I was calling to declare war. The season for teaching lessons was finished. The time for consequences had arrived. I pressed call. Rafferty picked up on the first ring. Hank, did you get in? I looked at the house one last time through the windshield. I got in Rafferty, and I found exactly what I needed. What did you find, Hank? I found the price tag. I found out precisely what I'm worth to them, and I found out exactly what Elaine was worth. A pause. Hank, you sound different. I am different, Rafferty. The Hank who paid the bills is gone. The Hank who looked the other way is gone. What are you going to do? I'm going to that wedding, Rafferty, but not as a guest and not as a father. Then what are you going as? I turned the key. The engine fired with a deep, angry rumble that matched the feeling in my chest. I'm going as the repo man Rafferty, and I'm coming to collect. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I steered onto the main boulevard. The city skyline climbed ahead of me, a jagged line of glass and steel, cutting against the blue sky. Somewhere in one of those towers was the law office of Rafferty and Associates, and somewhere else in a ballroom hung with crystal and silk, my son was waiting on a check that had already dissolved into the digital air. I pressed call again. The line rang. Rafferty picked up on the second ring, sounding breathless like he had been wearing a path in his carpet. Hank, he said, please tell me you didn't do anything rash. Please tell me you went in, had a look around, and left. I moved into the center lane, eyes forward. I didn't do anything rash, Rafferty. I said, my voice flat and even. I did something necessary. I have the evidence. The receipt is in my pocket, right now. A pause. The shuffle of papers on his end. What kind of receipt, Hank? A pawn ticket, I said. Midtown Pawn and Loan. They stripped the house, Rafferty. They took Elaine's paintings. They took her pearls. They took the watch I gave her the year Derek was born. They didn't rob the place, they liquidated it. I heard him draw a sharp breath. Oh, God. Hank, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. I cut him off. Be a lawyer. Open a file right now. Draft a criminal complaint. Grand larceny theft of property over $5,000. I want the paperwork ready to file by Monday morning. I paused. But that's not all. Hank, slow down, Rafferty said, his voice tight. This is your son. Once you file criminal charges, there's no walking it back. The district attorney takes over. He could do real time. I tightened my grip on the wheel until my knuckles went white. He sold his mother for $200, Rafferty. He made his choice. Now I am making mine. Write the complaint. I didn't give him room to push back. And Rafferty, one more thing. Pull up the trust documents. I have them, he said. Page 14, Section 3, the Asset Recovery Clause. I heard pages turning on his end. I knew that document cold. I had drafted it myself 5 years ago when I first started worrying that Derek had no real understanding of what money meant. It was a failsafe, a nuclear button I never thought I would actually have to push. I see it, Rafferty said, his voice dropping. Hank, that clause, it allows you to claw back any assets purchased with trust funds if the beneficiary engages in criminal activity or gross misconduct. Activate it, I said. Hank, Rafferty said, that means everything. The down payments, the furniture, the clothes on his back, anything bought with the allowance money you can legally seize. I know exactly what it means. Activate it. I want his accounts frozen. I want his assets seized. I want him to wake up tomorrow morning and own nothing but the regret sitting in his chest. I'll get the team on it, Rafferty said. His voice had gone quiet, resigned. He knew better than to argue when I spoke in that register. It was the voice I used when a subcontractor tried to shortcut a foundation pour. The voice of the man who was about to tear the whole structure down to the ground. I was about to end the call when my phone gave a sharp double beep. Call waiting. I pulled the phone back and looked at the screen. Derek. I stared at the name. It didn't stir any warmth in me. It didn't spark hope. It just made me feel tired. Hold on, Rafferty, I said. The defendant is calling. I clicked over. I didn't say hello. I just listened. What I'm about to share with you is the moment I understood the full depth of what had been done to me. Not just what was taken, but what it meant and what it said about the people I had given everything to. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone you loved had been quietly betraying your trust for a long time, would you confront them immediately, or would you take your time and let the truth do the work on its own terms? Dad? Derek's voice was pitched high, trembling on the edge of hysteria, loud and distorted like he was screaming to the phone while running. Dad, you have to answer me. What did you do? I kept driving. I watched the light bleed from yellow to red and brought the truck to a stop. I'm driving, Derek, I said, quiet and level. What do you want? What do I want? He screamed. I'm at the Sterling Grand. The manager just walked into the bridal suite. He pulled me out of the photos. He had 2 security guards with him. He says the check bounced. He says the wire transfer was recalled. Dad, he is threatening to throw us out. He says if we don't have $85,000 in a cashier's check in 10 minutes, he is canceling the wedding and calling the police for theft of services. I sat at that red light. It burned a deep, furious crimson. Is that so? I said. Yes, Derek shrieked. He is serious, Dad. Lacey is hyperventilating. Her parents are losing their minds because the limo never showed up at the airport. They're stuck in a cab somewhere in traffic. Dad, you have to fix this. Call the bank. Tell them it was an error. Wire the money back, please. Everyone is here. The guests are arriving. I listened to the noise leaking through from his end. Lacey crying, a low murmur of voices, the sound of a catastrophe unraveling in real time. It wasn't an error, Derek, I said. The line went silent. The background noise seemed to rise to fill the void. What? He whispered. I canceled the check, I said. I called the bank this morning. I told them the transaction was unauthorized because it was. I authorized payment for a family wedding. I did not authorize payment for a performance where I was barred from the door. But the wedding, Derek stammered. The guests, the food, it is all here. Then you better find a way to pay for it, I said. With what? He screamed. You cut off my credit cards. You took my car. You locked me out of my house. I have nothing, Dad. I have literally nothing. I reached into my pocket and pressed my fingers against the pawn slip. The paper was stiff and crisp. You have $1.200, I said. What? You have $1.200 for Derek from the pawn shop. Use that. It should cover the appetizers. There was a gasp on the other end, the sound of pure shock. He hadn't imagined I knew. He had thought he was careful. He had thought he was invisible. Dad, wait, he said, his voice crumbling to a frightened whisper. I can explain. It wasn't we were going to buy them back. We needed cash for the tip envelopes. We were going to get them back. I swear. You sold your mother, I said. My voice was no longer even. It was a growl, low and hard. You sold her to buy flowers for a woman who hates you. Don't you dare try to explain that to me. Dad, please. Derek was sobbing now, a raw, wretched sound. Please don't do this. They are going to throw us out in front of everyone. I know, I said. Dad, I am your son. Not today, I said. Today you are just a man who owes a great deal of money to people who have no interest in your excuses. Dad, wait. I pulled the phone away from my ear, looked at the screen one final time, and pressed the red button. The call ended. Silence settled back into the cab. The light turned green. I pressed the gas and the truck rolled forward toward the Sterling Grand. I wasn't going there to save him. I wasn't going to pay that bill. I was going to meet the officers Rafferty had called. I was going to hand them a receipt and point a finger. I was going to a wedding not with a gift, but with a reckoning. I pulled the Chevy Silverado up to the main entrance of the Sterling Grand. The truck was exactly what it looked like out of place. A procession of polished black luxury sedans and hired limousines lined the curved driveway, and my truck rumbled in among them with mud on the tires and a dent in the rear bumper from a job site accident 5 years back. Its deep, throaty idle seemed to offend the very atmosphere of this place. The Sterling Grand was a monument to neoclassical architecture, towering Corinthian columns, a facade of white limestone, blazing in the afternoon sun, and massive double doors of mahogany and glass. It was the kind of building engineered to make people feel significant simply by walking through its doors, the kind of place that sold the illusion of royalty by the hour. I parked squarely in front of the red carpet and killed the engine. A valet in a burgundy vest came jogging over his face, arranged in a mask of professional alarm. He waved his hands at me as though shooing something that had wandered in off the street, then rapped on my window. Sir, you cannot park here. This is a reserved zone for VIP arrivals. Deliveries go around the back. The loading dock is open until 3. I pushed the door open and stepped out. The valet took a step back, his eyes traveling over me from shoes to collar. I had on the navy suit I'd pressed the night before, 12 years old, but dry cleaned just for today. My shoes polished at the kitchen table that morning caught the light like dark glass. My tie was knotted with a clean dimple. I looked like a man who owned the suit. The truck told a different story. To this kid, I was a contractor who had taken a wrong turn on the way to a funeral. I'm not a delivery driver, son, I said. My voice was unhurried, but it carried the weight of 40 years of running crews. Leave the truck where it is. Sir, I really cannot allow that, the kid said, flustered. The general manager is very strict about this. We have a high-profile wedding, starting in 30 minutes. The Kowalczyk wedding. If Mr. Whitfield sees this truck sitting here, he will fire me. I looked at the boy, young, scared, just doing his job. I reached into my pocket, drew out $100 bill, and pressed it into his palm. If Whitfield gives you any grief, I said, tell him Hank said it was fine. The kid looked at the money, then back at me confused. Who is Hank? He asked. You'll find out, I said. I walked past him toward the doors. A security guard stepped into my path. Broad shoulders, dark suit, earpiece curled at his collar. He crossed his arms and planted himself squarely in front of me. He had the look of a man who took genuine pleasure in stopping people. Excuse me, sir, he said. Invitation. I stopped. I held his gaze. I don't have one, I said. Then I can't let you through. Private event guest list only. I'm the father of the groom, I said. The corner of his mouth moved a faint smirk. His eyes slid to my truck sitting on the red carpet, then to my hands, the rough and scarred hands of a man who has swung hammers and poured concrete for 4 decades. "Look, pal," he said the sir had evaporated. "I've been briefed. The bride and groom were very specific. They said there might be an uninvited guest trying to force his way in. Older man, disruptive. They said keep him out at all costs." "Disruptive," I repeated. "That's right. So turn yourself around, get back in that truck, and drive away before I have to call the police for trespassing." I laughed, short, dry, without a trace of warmth. "Trespassing, that's rich." "I'm giving you one chance to step aside," I said. The guard moved closer. He had 6 inches on me and was making full use of every one of them. "Or what, old man, you going to hit me?" "No," I said. "I'm going to fire you." He laughed, then a sharp barking sound that bounced off the stone columns. "You're going to fire me?" "Who exactly do you think you are?" "You're nobody. You're just some construction worker who got pushed out by his own kid. Now beat it." I didn't move. I took one slow breath. I looked past him through the glass doors. Staff moved back and forth inside, carrying trays of champagne. The chandelier hanging in the lobby caught the light, a massive crystal fixture that had cost $250,000. I knew that figure because I had signed the invoice for it. "Get Whitfield," I said. The guard shook his head. "I'm not getting anyone. I'm giving you 3 seconds to walk away." "Get Whitfield," I said, and this time my voice didn't rise. It detonated. The voice I had used to make myself heard over the shriek of jackhammers and the grind of cement mixers. The voice that did not request. It commanded. The guard flinched. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of doubt he hadn't expected to feel. His hand went to his earpiece. "Mr. Whitfield," he muttered into the mic, his gaze fixed hard on mine. "We have a situation at the front entrance." "Yes, it's the man you warned us about. He's refusing to leave. He's asking to speak with you." He listened for a beat, then gave a short nod. "Copy that." He turned back to me with a smug curl on his lips. "The boss is on his way out, and he's bringing the off-duty cops we hired for security. You're about to have a very bad day." I waited. I straightened my cuffs. My hand brushed the pocket where the pawn slip rested against my chest. A minute passed. Then the doors swung wide open. Whitfield strode out, tall, lean, slicked-back hair, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck. He looked rattled. He was sweating. He was probably already rehearsing how he'd explain the missing $85,000 to corporate headquarters. 2 uniformed officers flanked him on either side. The guard stepped back and gestured toward me like he was delivering a package. "Here he is, Mr. Whitfield." He parked that junk heap on the red carpet and threatened my job. "Do you want the officers to remove him?" Whitfield stopped cold. He blinked. His eyes went to the truck. Then they came to me. The color drained from his face so completely I thought his knees might buckle. His mouth fell open. Whatever angry speech he'd been building up collapsed before a single word could escape. He didn't see a gatecrasher. He didn't see a troublesome father. He saw the man who signed his paycheck. He saw the man who had purchased this building 5 years ago when it was a failing hotel and transformed it into the premier wedding venue in the state. He saw the man who sat at the head of the board table once a quarter and pressed him hard on profit margins and maintenance costs. "Mr. Kowalczyk," Whitfield stammered. His voice came out as barely a squeak. The guard shot Whitfield a confused look. "Yeah, that's his name. Kowalczyk, the father. Want me to toss him?" Whitfield wheeled on the guard. "Shut up," he hissed. "Shut up right now." He turned back to face me. His hands moved over his jacket, smoothing it with trembling fingers. Then he bowed, not a nod, a full deferential bow. "Chairman Kowalczyk," he said, his voice unsteady. "I had no idea you were coming. We weren't expecting you. Is this a surprise inspection?" The guard's jaw went slack. The 2 officers traded a glance and eased their hands away from their belts, taking a small step back. "Chairman," the guard whispered. I looked at Whitfield. I looked at the sweat collecting on his upper lip. "Hello, Whitfield," I said. "I see you're having some trouble with the payment for today's event." Whitfield flinched. "Yes, sir. A terrible misunderstanding. The wire transfer was reversed. We were just about to, we were threatening to cancel the event. The couple is inside. They're frantic." "I know," I said. "I reversed the transfer." Whitfield's expression went blank, like a circuit had blown somewhere behind his eyes. You reversed it, sir. But why?" "Because I don't pay for services I don't receive, Whitfield," I said. "And apparently I'm not welcome in my own building." Whitfield looked at the guard. The guard looked like he wished the pavement would swallow him whole. "Sir," Whitfield said, "if I had known if anyone had told me you were the father, my God." The groom never mentioned it. "Of course he didn't," I said. "He's ashamed of me, Whitfield. He thinks I'm just a retired contractor. He doesn't know I own the place. He doesn't know I own the holding company that owns the place. He thinks you answer to a faceless corporation." I took a step forward. Whitfield stepped back on instinct, clearing my path. "I'm going inside Whitfield," I said. "Of course, sir," Whitfield said, rushing ahead to hold the door open. "Right this way. Do you want me to clear the room? Do you want me to have them removed?" "No," I said. "Let them stay for now. I have a wedding to attend and a speech to give." I walked past the guard. He had his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to raise them to meet mine. I stopped in front of him. "You were doing your job, son," I said. "You were following orders. But next time, find out who owns the pavement before you tell a man to get off it." I walked through the doors. The air conditioning met me cool, clean, sharp. The lobby was magnificent. Marble floors, gold leaf across the ceiling. It was a monument to extravagance, and I held the deed to every square inch of it. From somewhere deeper in the building came the sound of music, a string quartet, playing something soft and costly. The low hum of guests drifted out with it. They were all in there. Lacey's family from Boston, Derek's friends, all the people who had decided they were above me drinking my champagne, standing on my floors, toasting a marriage built on my money, without the faintest idea that the man who owned the building had just walked in to collect what was his. I moved toward the ballroom doors. Whitfield skittered along beside me like a nervous terrier. "Sir," he murmured, "the officers you requested, the ones you asked to be on standby, they're waiting in the manager's office." "Good," I said. "Keep them there. Wait for my signal." "Signal, sir?" When I set the microphone down, I said, "That's the signal." I reached out and took hold of the handles of the double doors. I could feel the bass line of the music pulsing through the wood. It was showtime. I pushed through the double doors into the grand ballroom, and the sound of the string quartet rolled over me like a wave of expensive perfume. The room was breathtaking. A cavern of gold leaf and crystal lit by chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a decade. The tables were dressed with fine china and heavy silverware that caught the light and threw it back. The centerpieces were towering arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas, the very flowers bought with money from my wife's stolen locket. I stood for a moment just inside the entrance, letting my eyes find their footing in all that brilliance. I studied the guests. There were hundreds of them. Men in tuxedos, women in designer gowns, people who cradled their champagne flutes by the stem and laughed with their chins tilted toward the ceiling. They were the elite, the high society crowd my son had been so desperate to belong to that he deleted his own father to get there. And at the center of it all, raised on a platform under a spotlight, stood Lacey. She looked beautiful. I had to give her that. Her gown was a masterpiece of lace and silk, the kind of garment that costs thousands of dollars. She held a microphone in one hand, the other pressed theatrically to her chest. She was speaking, her voice trembling with a rehearsed emotion so convincing it nearly turned my stomach. "It is such a tragedy," she was saying, her voice drifting softly through the high-quality sound system. "We wanted him here so badly. Derek is heartbroken, but you have to understand, his father has been struggling with some very serious personal issues for a very long time." I stepped out of the shadows. I began walking down the center aisle. The carpet was thick and plush, absorbing the sound of my footsteps entirely. "Mental health is such a silent struggle," Lacey continued, dabbing at a tear that wasn't there. "We tried to get him help. We tried to bring him into our lives, but he isn't himself anymore. He's become unpredictable, dangerous even. So for the safety of everyone here, we made the hard decision to let him stay home where he'd be comfortable." A soft murmur of sympathy moved through the crowd. Poor Derek. Poor Lacey. Dealing with a troubled old man on their wedding day, I kept walking. I wasn't in a hurry. I moved with the slow, certain momentum of a freight train that has already committed to its track. Derek stood a few feet from Lacey, his head dipped in a posture of grief. He was playing the wounded son without missing a beat, nodding gently, receiving the room's silent sympathies. Then he looked up. He saw me. His eyes went wide. His jaw dropped. Every trace of sorrow vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of naked, uncontrolled panic. He took a half step forward as if to put himself in my way, then stopped dead. He saw the way I was walking. He saw the set of my shoulders. He saw the navy suit fitted on me like armor. He nudged Lacey. She stopped mid-sentence. She followed his eyes. When she found me, her face went the color of chalk. The microphone tilted downward in her hand. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. It started at the front of the room, where the couple stood, frozen and rolled backward, like a shockwave, until every single person had turned to see what had stopped the bride. The string quartet unraveled into a dissonant scrape of bows across strings. I didn't stop. I passed the table where Lacey's parents were sitting. Her father, Clifton, a man I had shelled out $12,000 to American Airlines to fly here first class from Boston, sat there with his mouth hanging open, a forkful of salmon suspended halfway to his face. Her mother, Nadine, looked at me the way you'd look at a rodent that had just scurried across the tablecloth. I moved past the friends Derek had collected in college, the ones who drove cars their parents had purchased for them. They watched me with mild curiosity. Who's the old man? Is he staff? Is he a crasher? I reached the steps of the stage. Derek made his move. He positioned himself at the edge of the platform, both hands raised. Dad, he hissed, his voice barely cutting through the low hum of the speakers. Dad, don't. Please just turn around. We can talk about this. I didn't look at him. I looked past him straight at Lacey. I climbed the steps. 1, 2, 3. I was on the stage. The spotlight struck me blinding intense. The heat of it was like standing under an interrogation lamp. I crossed toward Lacey. She retreated from me, pulling the microphone tight against her chest, like it might protect her. She shot Derek a desperate look, but Derek was frozen in place. He knew. He understood that any move he made now would only accelerate the blast. Give me the microphone, Lacey, I said. My voice wasn't amplified yet, but the room was so still it traveled without any help. She shook her head. No, she whispered. Get out. Security. Someone call security. There is no security, Lacey, I said. Or rather, the security works for me. Now give me the microphone. I extended my hand palm up. I didn't reach for it. I simply held it open. An invitation and a command wrapped into one. She scanned the crowd. She looked at her parents. She looked toward the exit. She understood she was cornered. If she wrestled me for the mic, she'd look unhinged. If she screamed, she'd look hysterical. She was trapped inside her own obsession with appearing composed. Slowly, visibly shaking, she surrendered it. I took it. It had some weight to it. It felt right in my grip. It felt like authority. I turned to face the room. I looked out across that sea of strangers, hundreds of people who had been forming opinions about me based on a carefully constructed lie. I tapped the microphone twice. Thump, thump. The sound detonated through the ballroom, sending tremors up through the crystal drops of the chandeliers. Good afternoon, everyone, I said. My voice came out low and unhurried, the voice of a man who has spent decades making himself heard over the roar of heavy machinery. I apologize for the interruption. I know you were enjoying the speeches. I know you were enjoying the wine. The vintage is excellent, by the way. I should know. I chose it myself. I caught Whitfield, the manager, hovering near the kitchen doors. He gave me the smallest, most careful nod. He'd done his part. The doors were sealed. Nobody was riding in to shut this down. My name is Hank Kowalczyk, I said, and contrary to what you've just been told, I am not battling demons. I am not mentally unstable, and I am not dangerous unless you consider telling the truth an act of violence. A ripple moved through the crowd. People shifted. Chairs creaked. This wasn't the script they had been handed. This was something unscripted and raw, and they were leaning forward to catch every word. I am Derek's father. I continued gesturing toward my son, who had buried his face in his hands and looked like he was praying the floor would open beneath him. And the reason I wasn't here earlier, the reason I wasn't sitting in the front row where a father belongs, is very simple. I paused. I let the quiet do its work. Let them sit in the uncertainty of it. I wasn't invited, I said. The murmur swelled. Shock. Genuine disbelief. Last night I received a text from my son. A polite text, I'll give him that. It explained that his fiancée Lacey felt my presence would be a distraction. It explained that because I spent 40 years of my life working with my hands, because I drive a truck and wear flannel shirts, I was too blue-collar for this occasion. I was told I would embarrass them in front of all of you, in front of her sophisticated family. I looked directly at Lacey's parents. Clifton set his fork down. Nadine looked like she'd bitten into something rotten. They told me I didn't fit in, I said. They told me I wasn't good enough to share in their happiness. But here is the part that matters. Here is what I think everyone in this room deserves to know. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the folded sheet of paper, the printed wire transfer confirmation. I unfolded it deliberately. The paper crinkled in the silence. Even though I wasn't good enough to attend, I said, holding it up toward the light, I was apparently good enough to pay for it. I read from the page. Wire transfer, amount $85,000. Recipient the Sterling Grand. Sender Hank Kowalczyk. I lowered the paper. I paid for the champagne you're drinking, I said. I paid for the lobster you're eating. I paid for the band. I paid for the flowers. I paid for the very floor you're standing on. I turned to face Derek. He was crying now, silent tears running freely down his face. You wanted a perfect wedding, Derek, I said. You wanted to play the prince, but you forgot something. A prince doesn't banish the king who built the castle. I turned back to the crowd. I am a simple man, I said. I built my life on honesty, on hard work, on loyalty. I believed I had passed those same values to my son. I believed I had raised a man, but it seems I raised a parasite instead. The room fractured. People were whispering, pointing, pulling out phones. Lacey was sobbing loudly, both hands pressed over her face. But that's not the worst of it, I said. My voice sharpened. The grief burned off, leaving behind the cold, clean edge of a prosecutor. Because when I canceled that payment this morning, when I decided I would not fund my own humiliation, my son and his wife didn't come to me to apologize. They didn't come asking for forgiveness. They went to my house. They broke into the home I had given them to live in rent-free, and they stole from me. I reached into my breast pocket and drew out the yellow pawn slip. This is a receipt from a pawn shop, I said, holding it level with my chest. Dated yesterday. They took the paintings my late wife made with her own hands. They took her jewelry. They took the watch I gave her when our son was born. They took the last tangible pieces of a woman who loved them without condition, and they sold them. They sold my wife's memory for $1,200 so they could buy more flowers for the head table. I turned and pointed at the towering arrangement of orchids behind me. Those flowers, I said, my voice tearing at the edges, those flowers were bought with my wife's soul. The room went dead. The horror was real and physical. It hung in the air the way smoke does after something has burned to the ground. Even the waitstaff had gone still. So no, I said, dropping my voice to just above a whisper that somehow reached the back wall. I'm not sick. I'm not crazy. I am just a father who is finally done paying for the privilege of being treated like nothing. I looked over at Whitfield. I gave him a single nod, and I set the microphone down. It hit the stage floor with a thunderous crack. Boom! That sound was the period at the end of everything I had to say. It was the signal. The double doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. 2 uniformed officers walked in, steady and deliberate. They didn't carry themselves like hired security. They carried themselves like the law. Handcuffs on their belts, hard expressions on their faces. They came down the center aisle, the crowd peeling away on both sides, like a tide pulling back. They were heading straight for the stage. I looked at Derek. He looked at the officers. Then he looked at me. His lips moved. Dad. I turned my back on him. I came down the stairs off the stage. I walked past the 2 officers without a word. I was finished talking. The debt had come due, and it was time for someone else to collect it. The silence in that ballroom was the kind you could choke on. The echo of the drop microphone was still fading off the gilded ceiling when Clifton Lacey's father shoved back his chair. The screech of it against the floor cut through the room like a fingernail dragged across a chalkboard. His face had gone deep purple, the color of a man who has always been able to buy his way clear of a problem and has just realized his account is empty. He leveled a trembling finger at me. Officer, he bellowed it, his voice reaching for an authority it didn't have. Officer, remove this man at once. He is trespassing. He is harassing my daughter. He is clearly out of his mind. This is a private family event, and he is destroying it. I looked at Clifton. I looked at his $3,000 suit, straining at every button. I looked at the gold watch on his wrist, worth more than my first house, probably. And I felt nothing. No awe, no deference. Just the cold, clear-eyed calm of a man who has already read the credit reports. I stepped off the stage. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for Clifton. The officers held their position waiting. They knew who had called them in. They knew who the injured party was. I came to a stop in front of Clifton's table. I put both hands on the white tablecloth and leaned in close enough to catch the scotch on his breath. "Sit down, Clifton," I said. He blinked, caught off guard by the command. "Excuse me." "Sit down," I said again, "unless you'd like me to mention to these officers the shell company in Delaware, or the 3 fraud lawsuits pending in Boston, or the fact that the townhouse in Cape Cod went through foreclosure 6 months ago." Nadine sucked in our breath, one hand flying to her chest. "How dare you?" she whispered. "That is a lie." "Is it, Nadine?" I said, holding her gaze. "Is it a lie that you maxed out your last credit card to pay for those plane tickets? Is it a lie that you're counting on your daughter to marry her, way out of the hole the two of you dug?" The room went quiet all over again. The same guests who had been murmuring about me were now fixed on the bride's parents, with an entirely different kind of horror. The facade was developing cracks. The gilding was coming away, and what it exposed was rot. "You see," I went on, letting my voice carry to the nearest tables, "I did my research. When my son told me his fiancée came from money, I looked into it because that's what a businessman does. And what did I find? Mirrors and smoke. A family that is every bit as broke as my son is just wearing better clothes." A strangled cry came from the stage behind me. "Stop it!" Lacey screamed. "Stop talking!" I turned back to face her. She was shaking so violently the lace on her gown was trembling with her. She had the look of something cornered. "We aren't finished, Lacey," I said. "Not yet." I reached into my pocket once more. I produced the pawn slip again, but this time I turned it over. Stapled to the back was a second receipt, smaller, printed on pink thermal paper. "The pawn shop keeps meticulous records," I said, holding it up. "When you sell stolen goods, they ask for ID. And sometimes, if you're making another purchase at the same time, they staple the receipts together." I walked back toward the stage. The officers fell into step behind me, one on each side, like a personal escort. Derek was staring at the floor. He couldn't bring himself to look at me. He couldn't look at Lacey either. He was folding inward, hollowing out. But Lacey's eyes were locked on the receipt in my hand, wide and unblinking, fixed on that pink slip of paper. She knew exactly what it was. I climbed the steps one final time. I stood beside her. I looked at the dress. It was a magnificent thing, layers of white silk hand-stitched lace, a train that pooled around her feet, like a low-lying cloud, the dress of a princess. "It's a beautiful gown, Lacey," I said. She said nothing. Her breathing had gone shallow. "It must have cost a small fortune," I continued. I glanced down at the pink receipt. $4,500, I read. "A cash deposit made yesterday afternoon at the bridal boutique on Woodward Avenue. The final payment to release the dress from alterations." I looked back out at the crowd. "My son told me Lacey had purchased this dress months ago," I said. "He told me her parents paid for it. That was a lie. Her parents couldn't pay for a sandwich." Clifton made a sound low in his throat, but he didn't rise from his seat. He stayed where he was, diminished. "So where did the money come from?" I asked. "Where does a couple with no employment and frozen bank accounts find $4,500 in cash on a Thursday afternoon?" I held the pawn slip up. "They got it from the pawn shop." I looked at Lacey directly. I looked at the diamond studs in her ears. I looked at the tennis bracelet resting on her wrist. "They sold my wife's engagement ring," I said, and for the first time my voice broke. "The ring I proposed with in 1981. The ring she wore every single day for 35 years. They found it in the safe in the closet. They cracked it open and they took it." The gasp that moved through the room was collective and involuntary. Everyone in that space understood what that meant. This wasn't ordinary theft. This was desecration. "And they sold it," I said, my voice rising. "They sold 40 years of a marriage. They sold the symbol of my life with Elaine. And do you know what they bought with it?" I pointed a shaking finger at Lacey. "They bought a dress. They bought a costume for a liar." Lacey looked down at herself. She stared at the white silk as if it had just turned to something burning against her skin. She tried to step back, caught her heel on the train, and stumbled, grabbing Derek's arm to catch herself. "Get off me!" Derek snapped, shoving her aside. The gesture landed like a slap, the groom physically pushing the bride away at their own altar. Lacey lurched backward. "You knew," she screamed at him. "You drove the car. You sat outside and waited. Don't stand there pretending you didn't know." "I didn't know you sold the ring," Derek shouted back, his face contorted. "You told me it was just the old silverware. You said the ring was safe." "You're a liar," she shrieked. You wanted that money just as badly as I did. Enough, I said. One word, and it cut straight through them. I turned to the officers. Officers, I said, I am Hank Kowalczyk. I am the owner of the property at Elmwood Drive, and I am the owner of every item listed on this pawn ticket. These two individuals broke into my home, removed property valued in excess of 50 $50, and sold it to a dealer downtown. I passed the receipts to the senior officer, a sergeant, gray-haired, with the kind of face that has absorbed too many years of watching people do terrible things to each other. He examined the papers. He checked the dates. He read the names. Derek Kowalczyk and Lacey Harmon, he said aloud. Yes, I said. That's them. I want to press charges, full extent of the law. The sergeant gave a nod. He stepped forward. His hand went to his belt. Derek Kowalczyk, Lacey Harmon. His voice was official and unhurried. You are under arrest for grand larceny, burglary, and trafficking in stolen property. The handcuffs came out with a sharp, metallic ratchet. Click, click. Derek's legs went out from under him. He crumpled to the stage, sobbing. Dad, no. Dad, please. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Get up, son, the officer said, taking hold of Derek's arm and pulling him to his feet. Hands behind your back. Derek looked at me. His eyes held everything, desperation, shame, a plea. Dad, stop this. I'll pay you back. I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes. Just make them stop. I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had steadied on a bicycle, the boy I had shielded from every rough corner the world had to offer, and I understood with a clarity that hurt that shielding him had been the greatest mistake of my life. You can't pay me back, Derek, I said quietly. The ring is gone, the paintings are gone, and the trust is gone. You're on your own now. The officer turned him around and snapped the cuffs onto his wrists. The sound was absolute. It was the sound of a life dividing cleanly into two halves, everything that came before and everything that would come after. Lacey was fighting. She was trying to bolt, but the weight of the train dragged at her. The second officer had her. She screamed and kicked and clawed. My dress, she wailed. You're ruining my dress. It's not your dress, the officer said, spinning her around. It's evidence, he cuffed her. She stood there, chest heaving, mascara streaking down her face, eyes hunting for her parents in the front row. Daddy, she cried, help me. Do something. Clifton looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the police. He lifted his napkin and touched it carefully to the corners of his mouth. He did not stand. He did not speak a single word. He understood that if he made himself conspicuous right now, the next pair of handcuffs might well be intended for him. The officers moved them across the stage. They guided them down the stairs. The walk of shame stretched out endlessly. The guests stood in silence as the bride and groom were escorted out, not toward a honeymoon suite, but toward a squad car. The white dress swept along the floor, gathering dust, a symbol of purity, being dragged through the wreckage of their own choices. I remained on the stage alone. The room was utterly still. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. They were waiting for me to say something more, to apologize, to offer some kind of explanation to release the pressure, but I had nothing left to give them. I looked at Whitfield. He was pale, but he was holding himself upright. He knew whose name was on the checks. Clear the room, Whitfield, I said. The party is over. Whitfield nodded. He turned and signaled to his staff. I came down the stairs. I didn't let my eyes drift to the spot on the stage where my son had been standing. I didn't look at the bride's mother weeping in her seat. I walked the full length of the center aisle. My footsteps felt weighted. I felt old. I felt tired. But underneath that, I felt something else, a lightness, the burden of the secret, the dead weight of the disappointment. All of it had lifted. I went through the double doors into the lobby. I went out the front entrance. The squad cars were already there, their lights throwing blue and red across the white limestone facade. They were loading Derek into the back of one car and Lacey into another. I didn't stop to watch it happen. I walked to my truck. It was still sitting right there on the red carpet, stubborn and battered and real. I got in. I turned the key. I put it in gear and pulled away. I never touched the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I already knew what I was leaving behind. A ruin. A wreckage. But the road ahead was open, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, it was mine. The fluorescent lights in the precinct interview room buzzed with a frequency that settled right at the base of my skull. It was a hard landing after string quartets and crystal chandeliers. In here, there was no champagne, no flowers, nothing but gray cinder block, a steel table anchored to the floor, and the smell of industrial cleaner, working unsuccessfully against decades of sweat and fear. I sat in a metal chair, back straight, hands folded on the table in front of me. I watched the door. I waited. When the guard brought Derek in, I almost didn't know him. The tuxedo that had looked so polished on that stage was a crumpled ruin now. Collar open tie gone. His face was blotched and swollen, his eyes nearly shut from crying. He wasn't walking like a man who had stood on that platform 2 hours ago. He was shuffling hunched over as if he were trying to fold himself small enough to vanish. He dropped into the chair across from me. The guard shackled his wrist to the loop on the table. The metallic clink filled the small room. Derek looked up. When his eyes found me, his face fell apart completely. He looked the way he had looked at 5 years old after he'd scraped both knees clean on the sidewalk pavement. "Dad," he choked. "Oh, God. Dad, thank you for coming. Please get me out of here. It's a nightmare. There's a man in the holding cell who won't stop screaming. I can't stay here. I can't do this." I said nothing. I just looked at him. I searched his face for the arrogance he'd shown me in my own driveway that morning. I looked for the cold defiance he'd had when he changed the locks on my house. It was gone. Every trace of it had evaporated the instant the handcuffs clicked shut. "Dad," Derek said, straining forward as far as the chain would let him, "you have to post bail. The lawyer said it gets set in the morning. Just pay it. Please. I'll pay you back, I swear. I'll find work. I'll do whatever you need. Just get me out of here." I leaned back. The metal of the chair was cold against my spine. "I'm not here to bail you out, Derek," I said. He went rigid. His mouth fell open. "What?" "I'm here to say goodbye," I said. "Goodbye," he stammered. "Dad, what does that mean? You can't leave me in here." I said. "And I am. But it wasn't my fault." He blurted the words piling into each other in a wave of panic. "It was Lacey. You know what she's like, Dad. She is consumed by appearances. She pushed me into it. She said we needed the money for the wedding. She said you'd never notice the jewelry was gone. She said the paintings were just old junk collecting dust. I tried to tell her no, Dad. I swear I tried. I told her it was wrong, but she kept pushing. She made me go through with it." I sat there and listened to him throw his wife to the wolves. The same woman he had promised not 2 hours ago to love and protect for the rest of his life was now just something to hide behind. He was ready to sacrifice her to save his own skin exactly the way he had been ready to sacrifice me to protect his social standing. It was pathetic. It was the most spineless thing I had ever witnessed. "Stop," I said. He stopped breathing hard. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked. "You are a grown man, Derek. You are 28 years old, sitting in a jail room, telling me that a woman made you steal from your own father. You're telling me you have no spine, no will, and no sense of honor." I loved her," he whispered, barely getting the words out. "You didn't love her," I said. "You loved what she represented. You loved the way she made you feel like you mattered. And you loved my money because it let you buy her admiration. But love isn't theft, Derek, and marriage isn't a conspiracy to commit larceny." "Dad, please," he sobbed, pressing his face into both hands. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know I destroyed everything. But prison, Dad, I can't survive prison. I'm not made for this." I looked at him, and the hard truth was he was right. He wasn't built for it. He was soft in every way a person can be soft. He had never once had to fight for anything because I had fought on his behalf every single time. I had made the road so smooth that he never developed the muscle to handle rough ground. And that was on me. That was the one genuine crime I had committed. "That is precisely why you need to stay," I said. He looked up, tears sliding off his jaw. "Why do you hate me?" he whispered. "I don't hate you," I said. "I love you. That's the tragedy of all this. I love you enough to let you fall." I stood up. The legs of the chair scraped hard against the concrete. "For 28 years I protected you," I said, looking down at him. "I absorbed the consequences. I covered the debts. I cleaned up the messes. And look at what that built. It built a thief. It built a liar. It built a man who would sell his mother's memory to dress up a banquet table." "Dad, no, I'm doing you a kindness, Derek," I said. "I'm giving you something I never once gave you before. Reality. There's no safety net. There's no checkbook arriving to make it all go away. There is only you and the law. But Lacey, he cried. What about Lacey? Lacey is in the cell block down the hall, I said. And if she has any sense, she's already blaming you, same as you just blamed her. You deserve each other. I turned toward the door. Dad, wait! Derek shouted, yanking against the chain. Dad, don't go, please. I'm scared. I stopped with my hand on the door handle. I looked back at him one last time. Good, I said. You should be scared. Growing up is terrifying, but it's the only road that gets you through this. I knocked on the steel door. The guard opened it from outside. Dad, Derek cried out, his voice splitting apart. Dad, come back? I stepped into the hallway. The door swung shut behind me, and the heavy metallic clang cut off his voice like a blade. I stood there a moment, in the quiet. It was a heavy silence, a painful one. It felt like severing something from myself, and at the same time, it felt like the only honest thing I had done in years. I walked past the booking desk, past the officers hunched over their coffee cups. I pushed out into the night. The city was loud and bright and indifferent. The world had kept turning. I walked to my truck, got in, and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel without starting the engine. I had lost a son today, but maybe in a few years when he walked back out through those gates, the man who emerged would be something different, something real, and if that happened, every dollar of that $85,000 would have been worth it. I started the engine, dropped it into gear, and I drove away from that building, leaving my boy behind to absorb the hardest lesson of his life. School was in session. It took 30 days to scrub the stain of betrayal out of my life. 30 days of lawyers' paperwork, signatures, and silence. The silence was the hardest part at first. The phone stayed quiet. No texts demanding money. No frantic calls about busted water heaters or maxed out credit cards. For a full week, I found myself checking the screen every hour out of sheer muscle memory. But by the second week, I'd stopped reaching for it. By the third week, I started to understand that the silence wasn't emptiness. It was peace. I went back to the pawn shop the Monday following the wedding. The owner, a guy named Sal, looked at me with a mixture of wariness and respect when I came through the door. He'd seen the news. The whole city had seen the news. I set the ticket on the counter along with a stack of hundreds. No negotiating, no haggling over interest. I just wanted my life returned to me. Sal retrieved the items from the safe Elaine's pearls, the gold watch, and the paintings. I unwrapped the canvas of the lake house. I ran my thumb across the dried oil paint, tracing the texture of the brushstrokes my wife had laid down 20 years ago. They were safe. They were home. But I didn't carry them back to my house. The house had grown too quiet, and I was through living inside a museum built from memory. I brought the jewelry to a high-end auction house and the paintings to a gallery that handled local artists. I wasn't after the money. I had enough of that. I wanted the energy around those things to move somewhere new. I sold the house on Elmwood Drive 3 days later. It went to a young couple, a mechanic and a nurse who came through the front door and looked around like they'd just been handed something sacred. They didn't push for upgrades. They didn't pick at the fixtures. They held hands and talked about which wall the crib would go against. I let them have it for 10% under market value, simply because I liked the calluses I could see on the husband's hands. When the check for the house cleared, and the auction house wired through the funds from the jewelry, I took every last cent and opened a new account, the Elaine Kowalczyk Scholarship Fund. It was for kids who wanted to go to trade school, kids who wanted to learn to weld, to plumb, to build things meant to last. It was the finest investment I'd ever made in my life. Now I sat in seat 1A of a Boeing 7. The leather was soft, far softer than anything in my truck. The air carried the smell of conditioned oxygen and expensive cologne. Mr. Kowalczyk, a flight attendant said, leaning toward me with a bottle wrapped in a white napkin. May I offer you a glass of champagne before we depart? I looked at the bottle. Dom Perignon, the same label that had been going flat on the counter of the house my son had torn apart. I smiled. Yes, I said. I'd love one. She poured the golden liquid into a crystal flute. The bubbles rose in a frantic upward rush, racing for the surface like they had somewhere to be. I took the glass. It felt light in my hand. I looked out the window. The tarmac hummed with baggage carts and fuel trucks, workers in neon vests doing the hard, invisible labor that keeps the world moving. Beyond the airport perimeter, the city of Detroit spread out below a wide grid of gray and green. Somewhere down in that grid, inside a county facility, my son was waiting on a plea hearing. He was learning how to make his own bed. He was learning that choices carry weight and consequence. The anger was gone. The fury that had run me like a fuel source on the day of the wedding had burned all the way down to ash, leaving something clean behind. I had done my part. I had raised him. I had given him everything I had. And when he went wrong, I had stepped in and corrected the course. What happened next belonged entirely to him. The plane began rolling back from the gate engines, spinning up through a low vibration that you could feel through the soles of your feet. I brought the flute to my lips. The champagne was cold and sharp. It tasted like something I hadn't had in a long time. Not the victory of defeating another person, but the quiet victory of getting yourself back. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I looked at the screen one final time. No missed calls. No messages waiting. I pressed and held the power button. The screen went dark. I tucked the phone into my bag and drew the zipper shut. I wouldn't be needing it for a while. I was going to Italy. Elaine had always wanted to see the Amalfi Coast. She used to talk about painting the light as it came off the water. We never went. I was always too deep in work, too busy constructing an empire for a son who turned out not to want it. Well, I was going now. I was going to eat pasta and drink wine and sit in front of the ocean for as long as I pleased. I was going to sleep past noon if I felt like it. I was going to spend my money on the kind of memories you can actually hold onto. The plane moved to the runway. The pilot came over the intercom with our flight time to Rome. I settled my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. For 66 years, I had been Hank the contractor, Hank the husband, Hank the father, Hank the bank account. Today, I was just Hank. The engines opened up to full power. The force pressed me back into the seat. We built speed faster and faster until the jolt of the runway smoothed away and the ground dropped out from beneath us. I opened my eyes and looked through the window. The city had disappeared, swallowed under a thick blanket of white cloud. Above it, the sun blazed brilliant, unobstructed, blinding. I lifted my glass toward the empty seat beside me. "Here's to you, Elaine," I said quietly, "and here's to me." I took a drink. The champagne rose up through my chest. If you've stayed with me this long, then you already know this story isn't really about a wedding. It's about what happens when a parent finally stops absorbing the cost of being taken for granted. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Walking out of that precinct, driving away from the place where my son sat in handcuffs, that is not something a father is built to do easily. It cost me something I'll never fully get back, but I believe God doesn't let those moments go to waste. The Lord's timing in all of it. The pawn slipped the receipts stapled together. The morning I happened to check that account, it was too precise to be coincidence. What was meant to destroy me became the thing that finally set me free. Here is what I took from all of it, and what I hope you carry with you. If you have been shielding someone from the consequences of their choices, understand that your protection may be the very thing preventing them from growing. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, not their words, believe them the first time. Your dignity is not negotiable. No amount of money spent on another person buys them the right to erase you. And if the people at your table don't know your worth, sometimes you have to be the one to stand up and remind them. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. In the comments I read them, and they mean more than you know. Share this with someone in your life who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Family Revenge Stories so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and don't you dare let anyone make you feel small.